There is some dissatisfaction about the loci within which one is required to look for presidential candidates. Time magazine's essay of the week begins, "Can anyone remember when he last went to vote for a U.S. president and felt both enthusiastic and confident?" Totally enthusiastic about his own candidate, reasonably confident that if his man lost, the other fellow would still be a good president. According to the writer, the last time that happened was in 1952, when the choice was Dwight Eisenhower or Adlai Stevenson. "Things may be bad," says Mr. Richard Reeves, "but they're bound to get worse." It is Mr. Reeves' thesis that Gerald Ford is the quintessential product that the system is now established. One gets to be president, he says in his best-selling book, A Ford, Not a Lincoln, by becoming the least objectionable person to the greatest number of people. He illustrates this thesis in a book about Gerald Ford, which is selectively and comprehensively hostile towards the man, his habits, and his record. Mr. Reeves was raised in New Jersey, the son of a county judge, and attended the Stevens Institute of Technology, where he took a degree in mechanical engineering. But at nights he freelanced in journalism, and before long he was on the staff of the New York Herald Tribune. From there he went to the New York Times, where he covered political stories, then on to Harper's and New York Magazine. His specialty is a robust and witty style, a marvelously acute perception. He is good at making it entertaining to read about the causes of the probable demise of self-government in America. I should like to begin by asking Mr. Reeves whether there is anything bland about George McGovern or Barry Goldwater, and if the answer is negative, do you go so far as to attribute their defeat to this factor?
I find McGovern rather bland personally. I don't find them as highly developed along the least objectionable alternative lines that I talked about as I think Ford is, and I think that probably, if you accept my view, and I know that you don't, or I suspect that you don't, that I think we're moving in that direction. I don't think that many of our recent politicians have been products of that. I don't think that Lyndon Johnson could be classified that way, nor do I think, for instance, Ronald Reagan could be. I think that they are coalition
for other reasons.
No, well, they may well be, but that they're coalition builders in the old sense of American politics, that they do have some kind of vision and are trying to group people around that vision and take them someplace.
Well, what is it that has happened in your understanding during the last few years that has accelerated the homogenization of presidential candidates? Is it television?
My suspicion is that it's the adaptation of people within the process to television and to instant communications.
How do you adapt to television? I mean, I'm asking this as a simple, as a professional question. If you were the advisor to somebody who wanted to be president, what would you just begin by telling him, say, not to do?
Let's say I were a traditional adapter. I would tell him that he's got to look at how television has conditioned people to perceive the things that they see on it, and that you are, after all, approaching them in their own living room, and you're approaching a group that cuts across all spectrums, and you should try to avoid, if at all possible, offending even the smallest part of that, because you are most likely to have to live with an aroused minority, have to deal with one, than with an apathetic majority. The apathetic majority is fine for you if you're an established politician.
Well, what is it that makes Ford successful as a television figure, or is he?
I don't think he's particularly successful. I suppose I think he's probably an adequate but not exceptional television performer. I think that he is far underrated as a television era politician, that he has in fact survived, spending his entire life in elective politics without particularly having done anything. And he happened to get to the highest office. I also find it interesting that he was the first person selected essentially for that highest office by his own peer group, not by the public at large.
Well, I want to return to that in just a moment, but I'd like to just track this, this line of your thought down, if I can. Who would be an example of somebody who is such a manifest disaster on television that he simply couldn't make it to New Hampshire, let alone back?
No one leaps to mind. I'm talking about using television as a communicator and a sales vehicle, not whether someone is better than someone else on television. I think my view of television is much more what the public has been conditioned to deal with than as to whether Ronald Reagan, say, is better on television than Gerald Ford, and most people would agree, in fact, he is better.
Well, what do you make of the traditional notion that democracy is primarily a negative instrument? That is to say that democracy is precisely useful insofar as it permits an aroused public to get up and say no, or to say to somebody, you've got to leave. We've had enough of you. That it is very seldom that you envision democracy as transfusing the elected leader with a program or a set of ideals. Usually he crystallizes those ideals on his own and then sells the people on them. If that is so, why oughtn't we to be satisfied with people who slide by for so long as they please the majority of the American people? They don't make very exciting people, but what is it that offends you as a Democrat? I have a feeling really that you're
Democrat, yes?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I have a feeling really that your dissatisfaction is more theatrical than political.
Well, some of it certainly is theatrical. It's much more fun to be a journalist if things are happening, and of course we tend to try to make things happen just to serve our own prolonged adolescence. I wonder, though, whether something serious isn't happening to democracy. And the fact that people are turning away totally from the process, either feeling that they're being had or that it really doesn't mean a lot to them or that they're helpless to do anything about it. And I think that by trying to offend no one, politicians, particularly congressional politicians, Washington politicians, maybe vaguely offending everyone, I find it maybe frightening is too strong a word, but that only 37% of even the people who are registered to vote, and that's not all of the adult American population, only voted in the last election. I think that'll go back up some during a presidential election, a heated one, but that decline continues, and that small d democracy may be atrophying around here.
Well, that is, of course, one explanation. It's one towards which I lean. However, there is another explanation, that the existence of which we ought to acknowledge anyway, and that is that the reason so few people vote is that there is no crystallized discontent with the two candidates, and they care, therefore, not very much which of the two wins. Now, this is paradoxical in a situation where you have, let's say, a new left guy running against an old right guy in a particular constituency. And it is for this reason that I lean towards your explanation. There's a sense that experienced by a lot of people that they can't affect the system, and under the circumstances they don't bestir themselves.
Well, certainly both of us have been around politics enough to know that once someone is an incumbent and is on some kind of upwardly mobile track, which tends to be something like an escalator rather than stairs, that it is in their interest to have no interest out there. Professional politicians like to keep the vote as small and as controllable as possible. And I think that is happening. Not that it was planned to happen, but that's happening on a national scale.
Well, it may be happening on a national scale, and yet in the very recent experience of America, twice, somebody has captured the imagination of the voters sufficient to get himself athwart a whole lot of entrenched establishmentarian opposition, the nomination of his party, Goldwater and McGovern. Now, they went on to be defeated for reasons which may or may not be extrinsic to this analysis. But the fact that they could capture the attention of the people the way these two men did suggests that there is at least latently there in the public an imagination that can be irrigated, right?
I certainly think so.
Now,
I hope so, and I think that a successful politics could be built around that, and I think that there may be a new generation of politicians coming along who may find it worth their while to try that.
What institutional changes, if any, would you recommend simply to make it easier for someone to surface as a serious presidential contender?
There are, like most journalists, I tend to shy away from solutions. If the country turned to me and said, what should we do? I would say that, I would say one thing you would say. I would limit the president to 1 6-year term. But I would also limit all public office holding to 8 years at a time with a...
even unusual senators?
Even unusual senators. And maybe a 4-year gap before someone could run for public office again. I mean, we have a country of, a Congress of at least, of professional candidates. What they do is run for a living. And I have always been struck by what Tom Eagleton said after his fall, when he was asked why did he have a breakdown after he'd been elected Attorney General of Missouri in 1960. And he said, well, you have to understand, there were no more crowds, there were no more cameras, there were no more planes. I had nothing to do.
That was the longest stretch he hadn't been on the public payroll in 40 years.
That's right.
Yeah.
It's the only time he hasn't been on the public payroll in his adult life.
Yeah.
And that he had nothing to do, being Attorney General of Missouri. Well, Washington is a town filled with elected people who have nothing to do except run for office. And I would like to forcibly, I mean, there's an arrogance. I would rather be a reporter-like than God-like, to force the country back into some kind of citizen politics as opposed to politics.
Now, there is a lot of sentiment for changing the system lightly in recognition of the changed circumstances of 1781 and today. And Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon backed the same reform, 4 years for a congressman. It never got off the ground. Is it as easy to understand why as that in order to get off the ground, the Congress itself is so accustomed to a life spent running that it wouldn't even want to alter the situation to its own benefit? Why didn't Congress...
That's interesting. I've never really thought why that reform didn't get off the ground, but it might be that they would have to spend some time either learning about thinking, the hardest work, or thinking about their district, or thinking about what Congress's role should be in the Republic. I have no strong feelings about the 4-year, 2-year thing. I think that 4 years would probably be preferable. The 2 years is absolutely grueling, and it's become more grueling because of improved transportation. It used to be that a congressman could go back to Washington if he were from Montana. It was clear he couldn't get back there every weekend. Now, with jet travel, he can get back every weekend, so therefore...
And is expected to. But
he thinks he's expected to. And that becomes the reality. So I suppose I would prefer the 4 years, but mostly what I'd like to do is get those guys out after 8.
But about the president, do you feel more strongly that we'd be better off with a president limited to a single term?
I think so. I mean, I think that in one of your books you use the term wearisome in talking about that reform. It has been discussed, and the reasons are so obvious that again, a man has to have time to deal with his own vision of the country and to try to persuade the country to move in that direction. And there is, certainly in his first 4 years, there's a certain incentive to avoid doing that.
Well, since these reforms do not appear to be in prospect, what is it that, in your judgment, could actually ignite the people at this point? In 1964, prematurely, as we view it, Barry Goldwater tried to ignite people against the idea of omnipotent government. The American people, it seems to me, are much readier to listen to those arguments today than they were 10 years ago. George McGovern was hoisted primarily on the matter of the Vietnam War, correct? Plus a certain redistributionist populism. What is it potentially this time around that could give us a surprise candidate?
I would think reduction of government and anti-government. I think that the politician most likely, or the politician who has flirted with that most successfully to this point in time has probably been Governor Brown of California. He's got a long way to go with that, but he certainly perceives what the mood of the country is. I think that both Goldwater and McGovern were done in by the same thing. You may not agree. I think that the worst thing that can happen to a politician running for an executive office is to have questions about his competence raised. If the thought occurs, can this man really handle the job, whether it's Mario Procaccino in the city of New York or George McGovern as president, that he can't get a listening to his ideas. And I think that happened to both Goldwater and to McGovern.
As a result of their own mistakes, or as a result of the strategy of the opponent?
Well, I think the strategy of the opponent in both cases was clever enough to exploit that, but I think essentially it was their own doing, that they got caught in that trap, and the press is always a willing participant in that kind of tearing down process. The people who thought that the press would be pro-McGovern, I think, misunderstood the press, even if in fact the press is generally liberal. They are much more happy tearing someone apart, whoever it is.
Well, on this matter of competence, I think you touch on an important point, which is largely psychological. Gerald Ford, you point out in your book, to put it lightly, does not exude competence. That is to say, he doesn't have a naturally authoritative manner. And that may be one of the reasons why he didn't run for president 10 years ago, or 4 years ago, whatever. On the other hand, having become president, something happens to the public psychology, and all of a sudden you are thought of as quite naturally a president. It happened to Harry Truman overnight. Now, does this, having served as president, is a candidate automatically relieved of any obligation to document his continued competence? Does the fact of his having served as president eliminate that question from the public mind? I
think that he certainly has that option, and I think that Nixon exercised that option in 1972. I mean, we, the press, tended to whine about the fact he was not campaigning. Well, why should he have campaigned? He had a record to stand on, and that's as good a campaign as any. Obviously, Gerald Ford, both because of the way he ascended to the presidency and because he has not been awe-inspiring as president, is going to have to go out and document that. Can I
and because he's challenging it, sure.
I only wanted to add one thing to that, the fact that, and the thing that disturbed me most, I don't know that I feel hostile to Jerry Ford. What I am upset about is the fact that Gerald Ford was, at least on paper, perfectly trained for the leadership of this country. If you wanted to, if 50 years from now some political scientist put down what would the training be, it would be to work your way up on national issues to the leadership of a party. He was our William Pitt the Younger. Yes. Tutored by John Stuart Mill and so on. And this is what that system produced. That's what got me upset. And if it came across as hostility, it was not to him personally, it was to that system and that result.
Well, a hostility to a system that finds a president on the eve of impeachment, looking for somebody who will be satisfactory to both houses of Congress, is a pretty extraordinary circumstance, isn't it?
It is an extraordinary circumstance.
And therefore...
They didn't all 535 of them have to stand up and applaud, though, about how well qualified and what a wonderful man he was. They could have, out of decency, kept their mouths shut, was my thought at the time. That's one of the things that struck me most about it, was the enthusiasm with which they, the national leadership of the country, greeted this choice.
Well, a lot of it was presumably cynical. In a matter of months, he couldn't get anybody to applaud him when he was delivering a State of the Union message. Don't you think that applause was personal to a considerable extent? They liked him, and also it was the kind of applause that comes after a sense of relief that it isn't somebody else. Somebody else defined in this case as somebody most likely to beat a 1976 Democrat, but very hard to vote against for
That's the kindest
reasons.
interpretation you could give it, but they were, in that sense, they were probably well, they were certainly misleading the country about what quality of man they had given the country, and they were preparing the country to dip deeper into its own developing cynicism by doing that. Because inevitably, people who knew him well must have known that Ford would not perform well. And I don't claim to be one of those people. When I started the book, I thought I might be writing a wonderful romantic story about the common man emergent.
And then he did things different from what you would have done if you'd been president, right?
I've read reviews that said that, but I hope that's not true, because I don't consider myself particularly ideological. If I have an ideology, it's just anti-politician. I believe that they should be poked at because they've certainly got people to tell everything that's good about them. They've got a mechanism to take care of that.
Well, that's true of presidents. I don't think that's true of everybody, do you? Not every politician has paid sycophants who have access to the press, do they?
You must introduce me to the ones that don't. I have rarely met...
Well, who is Beams, for instance?
Well, at Beam, of course, just let go 50 of his public relations men.
Well, maybe because they weren't doing any job for him.
They certainly weren't. But
they were unproductive sycophants.
The New York City government had, at the time I was covering John Lindsay, he had over 500 people whose single function was to pump out information that made him look good. I mean, that was literally the number he had, including the 6 who sat in the office next to him.
That couldn't have kept them very busy.
His deputy mayor was a public relations man and has gone back into public relations.
Yeah.
So that I think a president has more of it, and the president has much greater command of the tools of communication. He can generally preempt all of the news, but the media consultant and the press secretary are the coat holders of our time. That's literally what they do. And they're also there to give plausible deniability at all times. Politicians no longer have to, often, and particularly presidents, deal directly with questions. They can feed a Ron Nesson with part of the truth and then throw him to the wolves to keep them busy there in the daycare center.
Because that takes certain competence, doesn't it?
To do that?
Yeah.
Yes, and I think that the incompetence is on the press side not to point out that this is the way the most news in American government is generated.
Well, when you said a moment ago that the thing a candidate has to watch out for most is giving the public the suspicion that he might be incompetent, I understand that you are not saying that an incompetent man cannot make a successful president. I.e., it doesn't go on to that. This is not a syllogism.
No, I suppose it isn't.
Because you judge Mr. Ford to be essentially competent, but his presidency is not scandalously incompetent, is it?
I judge him to be competent as a politician, incompetent as a leader.
Yeah, and as president.
As president, because I tend to view the presidency as the symbol and leadership of the nation.
You do?
Or at least as the symbolic leadership of the nation. He is the only man who can speak with one voice for the United States of America. So hopefully he'll have something better to say than the wind speech when he does.
Isn't that sort of an unexamined myth that one picks up in kindergarten civics books? Because he doesn't speak, he can speak with formal authority, but there is no sense in which he speaks for me if I don't agree with him, or you, does he?
Well, we're prohibited by the Constitution, though, for speaking to the French directly in that sense. I mean, he is both our head of state and our head of government. And outside the 7-mile limit, he's us.
There's never been any prosecution under that law. But we're not allowed
I think they considered it with some people.
With Joe McCarthy.
Yeah.
It's true that you can negotiate with the foreign government. You can speak to it, though. You can go to France and England and say, I represent dissident Americans on Vietnam, and you get a very warm reception, don't you?
If they happen, it depends on which country you go to.
I can't think what country you can go to. Except South Vietnam.
There must be some left.
Yeah. Well, what I'm trying to approach is this. A president is asked to do so much as a result of 2 centuries accumulation of duties imposed on him that, in fact, he cannot be competent to exercise the kind of judgment that it is supposed that he will exercise, for instance, in deciding whether to lift the tariff rate tomorrow on tomatoes, right? So all of those duties have to be delegated. Ergo, if you cannot have a competent president, i.e. competent to discharge the duties that are imposed on him, you therefore are entitled to look for other qualities. And it may very well be that you can have a president who is very incompetent in the conventional sense of that word, but a splendid president. Maybe he can inspire people, for instance. Now, is this something that you would settle for?
Do you have anybody in mind with that? No, I think that that's very true. I mean, people have divided areas of competence, and whenever we talk about competence, we're only talking about a relative thing.
Well, I remember, as a matter of fact, the first person who mentioned this to me was a man called Professor Paul Linebarger from Johns Hopkins, who voted for Eisenhower with great distaste, because Linebarger was one of those sort of irreversible intellectuals who couldn't stand mixed up syntax, that kind of stuff. And it turned out that at one point he was going to have 5 minutes with Eisenhower. For some reason or other, he was an Oriental scholar, and he knew that Eisenhower wouldn't listen to his views on China or anything like that. So he decided to spend a lot of time thinking, what shall I say in 5 minutes with the President of the United States? And he thought that the one thing to say to the President of the United States, if that President is Eisenhower, is be optimistic. And I don't know what his formulations were during those 5 minutes, but he was very pleased with himself. And he was making a very solid point, that the strength of Eisenhower was a sort of a native, deeply rooted optimism about America. And in that sense, history may vindicate him as a competent president, although he was very incompetent, wasn't he?
Well, he was very incompetent in some things. I tend to believe, by the way, that he was a relatively and generally competent president. I don't know which revisionist school that now makes me part of.
Yeah.
I once had my 5 minutes with Ford, and when I was spending a good deal of time with him when he was vice president, and he was asked about how it felt to be that close to the presidency. And he said, well, he didn't know, that he never thought about it, and whether he meant that as a political answer, he meant it literally. I came to believe he meant it literally in some ways. When I had my 5 minutes with him and he asked me what I thought he should do, I said, well, think about it, God damn it. But I suppose that it is true that you are not going to get perfection. And I hope I have not come across as saying that I'm advocating finding a mythical Lincoln, even as opposed to the real Lincoln, because I don't think it exists. I think we can find more, or at least we can find and produce more competent people than we are now.
Well, yes, but can we elect them is really the conundrum, right?
I think so. I mean, we're down to a system where a smaller and smaller part of the country is voting or has any faith in government. I'm not a great poll quoter, but I see that
it's a pretty emphatic statistic.
But that only 14% of people now say they generally believe what the United States government says.
Yeah.
I can't believe that once you've got down to a base that low, that you cannot rearrange the electorate as it exists and add more people to it if you can just begin to raise that figure. Not you or me,
Yeah,
but
right.
that it can be done.
Right. Well, aren't you maybe asking people, though, to do psychologically impossible things? If you had said, for Ford was on this program a couple weeks before he became president, and I asked him the same question you did, and he gave me the same answer. I knew he would give that answer, but I didn't think I wasn't disappointed. I thought he handled the questions very nimbly. But so you can't, in the presence of your rich aunt, if she says to you, what are you going to do with all my money when I leave it to you after I die? You can't say, well, I'm going to do this and do that, do that. And Ford was required to proceed on the assumption of Nixon's innocence, publicly, right?
He was required up to a certain point.
And required to answer your question in the way he did, I think.
Well, he certainly was required to gracefully evade the question.
But you don't like that?
I'm not the greatest fan of graceful evasion. I often think that politicians
Well, you prefer to ungraceful evasion.
Can do better by keeping their mouths shut. But the fact of the matter is
You
that
should have said no comment?
no, that he should have avoided. I mean, that often they can avoid
How, for
a
instance,
situation.
how, for instance, would you put it? I'm you and you're Vice President Ford. Have you thought about what you might do if you become president, Mr. Vice President? What do you say?
I would say I don't think about it, but I'm grounding myself in all of the great issues and great questions of the day. He could have, he wasn't doing the second part of that answer. He was, in fact, not grounding himself. If you recall what he was doing and what he's continued to do and what he did when he was a member of the House was to travel all the time and make speeches all day and all night. And that's what he was doing in that period, too, where I'm sure we would both agree that maybe he could have spent some of that time talking to a few people and maybe even, perish the thought, reading.
Well, you just finished saying that your impression of Eisenhower was pretty favorable. He never read anything but 3 books by Zane Grey and 1 by Eric Hoffa.
More than that by Gray, I understand. I don't know how many Ford's read because he told me he had not read a book in 10 years.
Who told you that?
Ford told me that while he was vice president.
He did?
He did. But he said he didn't have time. But now the White House issues lists of the books he's read, so I'm not sure which is the real version.
You didn't happen to find out what the book was 10 years ago, did you?
No, I didn't.
Turned him off.
But he had no time to read. I mean, he was the ultimate American politician. He was spending 250 nights a year on the road in that period of his life.
But what do you suppose he does on Air Force One between here and Shanghai?
I think that I wasn't on the trip between here and Shanghai. I would think that in the times I've spent traveling with him, he has read a couple of staff reports, shot the bull at good length with either reporters or with assistants.
Well, that's some ways some people learn that way, right?
You don't learn much by shooting the bull with reporters. I would argue that, no, we're not, you're not, though. I mean, the fact is that a politician spending time talking to reporters is doing it as part of a wooing process, not as part of a learning process.
Well, I've never shot the bull with the president in that sense. What do they talk about?
I'm talking about, by the way, the long sessions like that were when he was vice president.
Yeah.
Now
what
he's much better
Don't they
guarded
talk about
and-
public issues? The reporters and the president?
I remember the last conversation we had like that, and it was about hot air ballooning. And
You learned a certain amount about hot air ballooning.
learned an awful lot. Ford had actually been lost over the Mojave for a day, and no one knew about it at that time. He was with one of his sons floating, and apparently it was a very, very enjoyable experience. But I mean, that's the way he has tended to spend his time, and it's very clear that if you go through and try to figure out day by day what in fact he does, is he does deal in short memos and long rambling conversations, often almost seminar, both in economics and foreign policy, which is the influence of the people around him. He is.
Well, when you go to Rambouillet to shoot the bull with Giscard d'Estaing about international monetary policies, you've got to have read something, don't you?
The first time he met with Giscard d'Estaing, the part of the U.S. condition was that there would be no single meeting alone, that Kissinger had to be present at all times, even though the French persisted in trying to arrange a solo meeting between the two heads of state. The two heads of government did not happen.
Is that unprecedented?
I don't know whether that's unprecedented. In my, except for translators, I think it probably is, but I'm not sure of that.
Well, certainly fiscal policies under FDR sound retrospectively as though they had been conducted in conferences in which Roosevelt didn't have any technical advice, doesn't it?
Well, the part of what I discovered in looking both into Ford's background and into the first 100 days of his presidency was how appallingly ignorant the man was. And I'm using the word technically. I hope it comes across more pejoratively. He has very, very little information, and I think that's true of the great majority of national-level American politicians that I've dealt with. They have very little information. They usually have enough information to get through Meet the Press, and that's about it.
Well, but you need quite a lot, don't you, to get through Meet the Press?
Not if you are at all a student of the press. You can generally, having just come off of Meet the Press with a very glib politician, the governor of New York, 80% certainly of what he was asked on that show, he or his staff could have easily anticipated. I mean, I think the press is a pussycat. That's part of the thing that I think has gone wrong with this fabled adversary system. I don't think we play our roles as adversary very well at all. I don't think we're particularly well informed.
Can you think in the last 3 or 4 presidential elections of anybody who achieved the nomination who would not have achieved it if he had been extensively interrogated by other than pussycats? Now, we certainly know the Goldwater didn't have pussycats asking him questions. It was more like scorpions than pussycats, but whom have we sweethearted? As a matter of fact, Teddy White once told me that he ran interference for Ike and for Kennedy, although Kennedy was very well briefed and was a reader, right? So who do you have?
I don't think he read as much as we were told.
Nobody did.
Liberal Democrats have because they spend a lot of time around college professors, always have lists of reading to hand out, although often if you have read the same things and check in any depth, you have your strong suspicions about whether they've actually read them or not. I wonder how well any of them would have stood up to well-informed questioning, or at least if some of them would stand up. We're still talking about a one-on-one situation, and I suppose, I hate to use the phrase, but you're always going to pick either the better man or the lesser of two evils. But at least the United States, from that experience, would have a much better view of how capable their leadership really is.
Well, is it a matter of capacity or is it a matter of agility? Look, if you have a situation in which 4 members of the press are allowed to question really extensively, no holds barred, a presidential candidate on any issue, it means that the member of the press can become, in anticipation of this session, totally conversant, let's say, with the problem of foreign exchange. But the president or the presidential candidate not knowing what he's going to be asked, has to be familiar with all subjects. Now, the Prime Minister handles it, as we both know, by the requirement that the line of questioning that he's going to entertain in the House of Commons has to be posted a couple of days ahead of time, so he becomes an expert in that particular field in time to answer those questions. But I don't see how a presidential candidate can be expected to be an expert in as many fields as interest America.
I don't think you can either, and I think that they should...
Limit it?
No, well, I think I mean, obviously, no politician is going to put himself in a situation where he doesn't have some kind of control. But they could also say that they don't know, and they'll look into it, having found out that or having not found out that there's some reason they should be interested in it. Ronald Reagan has, as governor of California, used that device very, very well, and Brown has also taken that up, of saying that he doesn't know something. I think one of Ford's great failings is that he feels compelled to talk at great length about things about which he clearly has no information, and that in doing that, he is adding to what I feel are the twin credibility gaps in the country. One is people more and more don't believe what their government is telling them, but not worse than that, but parallel to that, they don't believe the government knows what it's doing.
Well, then this incompetent factor can be disqualifying for an incumbent?
I'm not sure I understand that.
Well, if you say they don't know what they believe that he doesn't know what he's doing, then he's incompetent, right? And we come back to the question
they believe
of
he's
whether,
incompetent.
Whether an incumbent, if it is established that he is incompetent, gets booted out of office.
Well,
Is it predictable that Mr. Ford will either fail of renomination or fail of re-election because of the alleged incompetence?
Well, I'm only one citizen. I think it is predictable that he will fail, and I suspect on the nomination of certainly for that.
Not because of his policies.
I think not because of his policies, and certainly not because of his personality, which I think the American people find generally pleasing.
So that if the identical policies had been racked up by, say, John F. Kennedy, it would not have endangered his political prospects.
If I'd have to think about that question. I mean, I suppose I'd have to stand on the fact that I do not think that that policy is Gerald Ford's great political problem.
Miss Heidi Fisk is from Institutional Vesta. Miss Fisk?
I'd like to ask you what changes in the system you would like to see to get non-mediocre people in national office other than limiting terms and also limiting the number of terms.
I suppose the other procedural reform that I would like to see is forcing the American people to come to grips with campaigns on some kind of level. By that I literally mean that I think that as the price for the enormous privilege that the networks have of the 13 channels, that American campaigns would have to preempt television, I mean, for a given number of time during a campaign, so that...
Without an escape hatch? I mean, so that wherever you turn there's a candidate?
Without an escape hatch. Without an escape hatch.
No television or it's a candidate?
That's right. You would have to deal, and it would have to be done enough so that people would get tired of bowling and the movies and everything else.
I know what platform I'd run on to end that law.
To end that law. I think it would be unpleasant, but I think that...
no, I know, I agree with you. I like to see it happen, but anybody running on a platform to repeal that law would win the election.
You may have me there. I don't think so, though. I think that I hope that people would take the responsibility more seriously than that. And, I mean, it would be different kinds of structured time, in my mind, if I were handled. I mean, they could run films. There would be mandatory debate, mandatory third-party questioning. By third party, I mean people who are not, whether it were the press or academics or the first 18 people who walked by on Fifth Avenue, so that people would have some idea of which of these people they found superior.
Wouldn't that give a preternatural advantage to people who are naturally glib?
Yeah, but politics, I mean, that already exists in politics. I mean, life is unfair. People who are pretty glib have a natural advantage anyway.
I don't have much hope for that reform, so what other reforms would you
Those are
have?
the only, I'm much more a pure reporter and observer than political scientist or
Reformer.
Or reformer, you know. Bill wrote 4 reforms. I suppose if I wrote it, it'd be 1 reform.
Mr. Jeffrey Madrick is with Business Week. Mr. Madrick?
Mr. Reeves, I think your viewpoint is fairly narrow, or at least shaped by only the most recent history in at least 2 respects. One is the idea of the least objectionable candidate, the kind of lowest common denominator of television, may be more a reflection not so much of the political process, but of the notion of the probability that there is no profound consensus in the country any longer. That there is no profound ideology that is a majority that might elect a president with some kind of ideological commitment. And that the profound questions are much more divisive than they are today. And therefore you get somebody who can't grope with the profound questions. In that sense, he becomes the least objectionable candidate.
I think there's a good deal of truth in that. I also tend to believe that that the incumbent president is far less suited to deal with that than many other people would be, and many other politicians. I mean, I don't want to.
But the enormous attention that you and a lot of other people in the press give to the matter, the political structure, kind of diverts attention to what may be the real issues. The real issues are not being sounded, and the press isn't helping to sound them.
Listen, I couldn't agree more. But I don't think the press is not helping. I mean, the press is an immature institution that largely responds to its own pressures, like most institutions do. What disturbs me more than that is that I don't think that the political system is responding, and I think it's getting less and less capable of responding, and that Ford just happened to be a handy example of that, partly because he is not glib, and he's not as good as covering his tracks and covering the decision-making process or non-decision-making process than, say, a Richard Nixon or a John Kennedy was. In that way, I found him an invaluable resource for a reporter, although there may be a certain cruelty in viewing him that way.
Well, but by citing the irresponsibility of the press, it doesn't exonerate you or the press. I mean, you have to address the issue. Just let me ask one other quick question.
You have to define the issue if I'm to address
well,
it.
I think I did define the issue. There is not a profound ideology, and the press prefers to pick on people who are rather easy to criticize, like Gerald Ford, than to address the real issues. But let me ask one other question, which I think is equally dangerous. That is, the whole idea of limiting office to 1 term, in a way, flies in the face of democracy. And you yourself said the best campaign is your own record. Okay, by saying that record, by saying that record should not be decided on by the people in the next election, is a very cynical attitude towards democracy, and probably one shaped only by the most recent events and the mechanization and professionalization of politics.
No.
I mean, that's a dangerous notion.
I just make one minor correction. I'm not necessarily talking about 1 term. I'm talking about some kind of finite time limit, whether it's 2 4-year terms or whatnot. Certainly it is not shaped by the most recent events. It is, without approaching the question of whether it's cynical, it's based on the experience that I've had in the 15 years I've been lucky enough to be able to make my living watching politicians, on the fact that I cannot escape the conclusion that an incumbent who gets in office and keeps a low profile can probably stay in office forever in not forever, for a long, long time in a legislative job, that the system as it now works has been manipulated by the people within it, what I call professional candidates, and they have figured it out, and it's got to be changed to protect against that particular expertise that they have.
Well, I don't see any, if I may add something, I don't see any contradiction anyway, because if you say you're running on your own record, Mr. Reeves went no further than to say that Nixon, since he was running again, was running on his own record. But if you aren't running because you're not allowed to run, as for instance, nobody may run for a third term, it may very well be that you have a better record to bequeath the people with. I think that's
well,
at the heart of the argument.
I understand that that's the heart of the argument, but what that argument implies is that the people, that by worrying about how the people will judge your record, you'll come up with a worse record than you would otherwise. And that seems to me to be extremely cynical and anti-democratic.
No, I don't think it's cynical at all. It simply distinguishes between tactics and strategy. Nobody doubts that a lot of presidents do certain things that they really oughtn't to do, and don't do certain things that they should do in the 12 or 15 months before they're running for re-election. Nobody doubts that. And under the circumstances, it seems to me that reformers on this issue would like to avoid that situation and allow a president the kind of strategic security that he feels by not having to lust for another 4 years, beginning a few weeks after he begins his first term.
And we've already, of course, I mean, Bill reminded me, of course, we've already started down that road, because we do, in fact, limit a president to 2 terms.
Yeah. And by the way, the first amendment to this effect was introduced in 1806, and there were 60 votes cast by the Constitutional Convention before they decided on a 4-year term. So it isn't a totally new concern.
It was also a view shaped by a recent monarchical experience.
Sure. Well, Watergate brought the problem to mind.
Will you take on faith, though, that was not, well, please take on faith that I thought that a long time before, before they did whatever they did to Larry O'Brien's rug, which I now see is for sale.
I believe.
Miss Eileen Shields is with Time Magazine. Miss Shields.
Yes. In the beginning, you said that you were going to almost write a positive book.
I was willing to, ready to.
Willing to. What changed? I mean, can you point to maybe one thing that changed your mind? For example, the pardon of Nixon. I haven't gotten quite clearly what you found so appalling in the first 100 days that made you come out with a very negative book.
What, I'll answer it backwards. What I found so appalling was spending 100 days in and around the White House and around the President of the United States and seeing the way the place actually operated. I mean, it was just mind-boggling. I recommend it to any American citizen who can get press credentials, and anyone can. Just to get that close to it was an extraordinary experience, to see how presidential decision-making actually works, particularly when you have a president who seemed to me to be quite unprepared. There is no doubt that the pardon was the point at which I knew that it would not be a positive assessment, because it was my feeling then, and it is my feeling now, that whatever the merits of the case and whatever mercy involved and charity involved in it, that the individuals involved were not the question, that it was an incredible failure of leadership and imagination for Ford not to realize what both short-term and I think long-term effect that would have on the view of the people of the United States toward their system and toward their governors.
Now, you obviously don't think there was some deal, though. In other words, that this was part of the package he would become president and then he would pardon Nixon. You've dismissed that idea, I suppose.
There is no doubt in my mind that before he left office, Richard Nixon knew that he would be pardoned or whatever necessary to avoid his individual suffering.
Why did you describe the elation of Richard Nixon on receiving the news?
Well, I can't plumb his
But if there's no doubt
his
in your mind that
emotions
he
at the
knew,
moment.
why should he be elated if he had foreknowledge of it?
I mean, I suppose my answer would be that he should have been elated about it, but there was no doubt. I mean, this is just a reporting process. Unless I am incompetent as a reporter, there were people in the White House before Nixon left who, after the conversations, the 8 hours of conversation between Haig and Ford, knew that that the question of individual punishment for Nixon was no longer operative, to use that word, and then they went into the business of trying to make certain records and documents inaccessible.
Incidentally, may I just say this? Since we don't have any, I think if that's true, it was absolutely okay and commendable. If, in fact, Nixon said, look, unless I know that I'm going to be pardoned, I'm going to stay in here for the next 6 months and fight impeachment, the Republic would have been shattered as a result of that decision. So even if it were so, and I have no reason to suppose it's so other than you tell me, I think it would have been a statesman-like concession for him to make, just as I think it was a statesman-like concession in the case of Agnew for Elliot Richardson to act as he did.
I think that you could carry that argument long and far, that it was the right thing to do at that time. I try not, at least in the book, to argue that point. I only try to make the case that, in fact, there was an understanding. The word deal implies to me, by the way, that it was said to Ford, if you do this, I will do this.
Thank you very much, Mr. Reeves, author of Ford, Not a Lincoln. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen of the panel. Thank you all.
For a printed, bound transcript of this program, send $1 to Firing Line, Post Office Box 5966, Columbia, South Carolina 29250. That's $1 to Firing Line, Post Office Box 5966, Columbia, South Carolina 29250. Production funding provided by public television stations, the Ford Foundation, and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.